Okay, here is the second part of the video lecture on learning for Sissonville High School. This should be the last slide that you saw for the first presentation. I was setting the stage for a discussion of learning, and this is a definition that I wanted you to have down. Now, it's easier to talk about common features that any definition of learning would have. And that's what I'm going to do at this point. There are 4 common features of any explanation or definition of what learning is. First of all, we know for sure that a physical change takes place in the brain. As you're sitting here learning right now about learning, your brain is changing form and shape. It's not necessarily getting bigger, but it's changing shape. We also know that learning is due to experience, the second point. And we can all think of examples of times where we've learned through experience, maybe in a relationship or maybe on the job, maybe, again, if you play a sport, you learn. You learn from experience through trial and error. Also, learning is inferred or assumed through performance. And again, if I didn't say it, these are things you'll definitely want to have in your notes. You want to have all of this stuff in your notes, from this slide especially. No one has ever observed learning directly. In other words, I can't stand up in a classroom and look at you and say, "Oh, I see it. I see that learning is happening," because you're looking at me. You're writing notes. You're asking questions. That's no guarantee. I have to assume that learning has occurred through some kind of a performance measure, like an exam, for example. And even that's not a 100% guarantee. Reflection of that learning has occurred, because sometimes you may take a test, you may know the information, but you do poorly on the exam, so there's even some trouble with that. Also, a change in behavior potential. We all learn things, and I've heard people say a million times, "Yeah, Brandon, I'm never going to drink again. I'm not going to jail. I'm not losing, out on my relationships. I'm never going to drink again." And then 6 months later, they're at a bar and they're drinking again. So we'd like to say that we learn from our mistakes, but sometimes our behaviors don't show that. Now, 2 very simple forms of learning. Your book talks about these, and I'm going to talk about them as well. Habituation, also known as desensitization, and sensitization. I realize the slide is kind of diagonal here on purpose, but hopefully you can still read. You can still read the terms. So we'll take them both here one at a time. Let's start with habituation, or desensitization. Very simply, this means that repeated exposure to a stimulus or to something will actually decrease your reaction to it. In other words, the more you are exposed to something, the less it affects you. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how we learn through habituation. Again, keeping in mind, the more you're exposed to something, the less it affects you. I remember the very, very first time that I watched a scary movie. For me, it was A Nightmare on Elm Street with Freddy Krueger, the guy with the glove and the big blades that came out of it. I was very young when I watched it. The first time I watched those movies, I was not able to sleep the following night. I was so scared, out of my mind, that something was going to happen. Every little creak in the house I heard, paid attention to. Thought it was Freddy coming in to kill me. And now that I'm older, I watch those movies, and I've seen them dozens of times. If I watched that same movie today, right now, it would probably make me chuckle. I would laugh. It would not be scary at all, because I've been exposed to it so much. It just doesn't bother me. Maybe a better example, if you live somewhere out in the country, or if you live like when I did, in Nitro, one of the first homes that we had, my parents moved us into a house, and my bedroom was right beside a set of train tracks. And I was not used to living by a train or by train tracks. I remember the first night, I was like 7 years old, the first night a train came through, which was literally right beside my bedroom. The train whistle, the noise, everything was shaking in my room. It scared me to death. I remember thinking we were having an earthquake, running to my parents' bedroom screaming. And basically they were like, "It's just a train, just go lay down." So I did. Now, 6 months later, a year later, I didn't even pay attention. I'd heard the train so many times that it just didn't affect me. I didn't pay attention to it. That's habituation or desensitization. The more I was exposed to the train whistle, the noise, the vibrations, the less it affected me. I didn't even notice it. Also, people ask me what I do for a living, and when I tell them I'm a prison psychologist and I talk to them about what I do, the first thing they ask is, well, Mr. Dean, what's the first, or what's the worst thing you've ever seen, or what's the worst offender that you've ever dealt with? And I tell them that I work with sex offenders, people who perpetrate sex crimes against children often, and I will tell them that story, and they'll look at me in amazement, like, how can you tell us this story just so casually? Does it not bother you? Well, certainly it does, but when you do it for a living, it's like police officers, firefighters, anyone, veterans, people in our military. When you're exposed to death, when you're exposed to terrible situations every day, it becomes a part of your job, and it just doesn't affect you quite as much. So you become desensitized. It's not to say that you're heartless, but you become habituated or desensitized to that. Now, the opposite of desensitization or habituation is a process called sensitization. Sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes when you're exposed to something, a stimulus, it can actually increase your reaction to it. The very first time that the very first time that I watched the Halloween movies, for example, the music that I'm talking about, the theme song to Halloween, I can't do it justice, but you know what I'm talking about, or the theme song to the movie Jaws. I had watched those movies years and years ago, and I remember not having watched them for a long time. I remember being out in the woods almost in the middle of the night. I was helping my daughter get ready to work in a haunted trail in Nitro. And I noticed that they started putting a movie theater up, like an inflatable movie theater, which I thought was pretty cool. And then I heard them start playing the theme song to the Halloween movie. And for that split second, it was almost like, oh my gosh, what's going on? It was kind of scary, actually. I backed into a tree. I became really vigilant, was kind of looking around to make sure that, Michael Myers wasn't anywhere around. He's the murderer, psychopath in the Halloween movies, by the way. So that's an example of sensitization. That initial exposure to that stimulus heightened my awareness or increased my responsiveness to that. Another example might be, this might be a better example, if you're asleep, you may have the TV on, there may be loud music outside, you're not really paying attention to it, but it becomes louder very quickly, and it wakes you up. And you're like, whoa, what is that? And now that you're listening to it, you can hear the music outside or the TV in the next room. It's hard to get back to sleep because now you're tuned into it. You're overly responsive to that stimulus. So those are some examples of sensitization. And if you don't know who Michael Myers is from the Halloween movies, well, there's a couple of images of him. So now we're going to get into the 4 major types of learning. And these are going to take some time. Probably going to, after this slide, I'm going to call this the end of the second part on learning. Again, I'm required to cover with you all of these types of learning in an Introduction to Psychology class. And I feel, especially with classical conditioning, which can be kind of complicated, the video format is probably best because you can watch this repeatedly and kind of go back over it and over it. Your textbook does a good job as well, but I want to make sure that I walk you through these carefully. So we're going to take these one at a time. We're going to talk about classical conditioning. We're going to talk about operant conditioning, cognitive learning, and observational learning. And we'll start in the next PowerPoint presentation with classical conditioning. So we'll call that the end of this part.